talking with you today. I really appreciate that so much. I am so excited to see that we have 96 people so far, so that is absolutely fantastic and just really super exciting. So thank you. What I'd like to do is just tell you just briefly about myself. I'm Kris Fleming, and I've been a part of the movement for a good bit, and it's really exciting for me whenever advocates come together in any way, especially when it's this many advocates. And it looks like I have 102 now. So I think it's just a testimony to advocates' willingness to learn with each other and about the importance of our topic in general today. Before we really jump in, I want to say that I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to work with Kris and Ben. They're just fun and wonderful people, and I want to thank them for letting me be a part of this, and really take also a moment to thank Casey and the National Domestic Violence Resource Center for hosting this webinar. I'd like to also thank Second Chance and Jacksonville State University's Women's Issues Support and Empowerment, a feminist organization on their campus, for being a part of this today as well. We want to thank you for being here, and throughout the development of the webinar, we've talked more than once about how excited we are to learn about your experiences with this topic and want to explore with you. Since so many of us are already talking about this together and considering the topics on our own, we want to really just encourage you to use the chat function, and then also if you are on Twitter or Facebook, I'm more of a Facebook girl, but if you're on Twitter, if you use the hashtag #EngagingMen during the presentation, I'll be watching for your questions, and if they're not directly addressed during the presentation, all of the questions will be compiling them to answer in an email later this week or next week. And additionally, if you're interested and you want to, you're welcome to tweet a picture of yourself participating in the webinar. We think that's a lot of fun. I've already sent one out to so you can see my messy office. The advocate community really is so small, so it's always fun to get connected this way in a way to put names with faces. So let's get started. When we were working together to create this, we wanted to have some agreed upon definitions. And when we are thinking about this, we want to also make sure that we're going to stress that we completely understand that as feminist advocates, our definitions can stretch and change with our understanding of the concepts as they evolve and they grow. And so these definitions are in no way meant to be the only definition for these concepts, but a chance really more for us to have a common understanding as we come together for this presentation. So if you have a different definition or thoughts about any of that you'd like to share with us, we really encourage you to do that in the comment box. So our first definition is violence against women. The World Health Organization defines violence against women is based on the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1993. That document stated that violence against women is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is a likely result in physical or sexual or psychological harm or suffering of women, including threats, such as acts, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. Intersectionality, and there are many definitions of this, but I'm sorry, did I skip ahead too far? Sorry about that. Oops. No, sorry. Intersectionality. Is for us is that's a revelation. I'm sorry, I'm nervous, so I'm going to slow down for a second. Intersectionality is a realization that the oppressive institutions are interwoven and that they impact all of our lives. And certainly we need to be discussing intersectionality anytime that we're addressing engaging men or any of our advocacy topics. And we also want to talk about male and masculinity also. We know that there's many different, that gender is fluid and on a spectrum, and with male and masculinity, you'll be hearing those terminologies throughout this presentation as well. Okay. Now, before we totally turn this over, what I'd like to do is introduce our next presenter. Kris Macomber is a sociologist who specializes in inequality and gender-based violence, ally activism, social movements, and public sociology. She's earned her PhD from the North Carolina State University in 2002, and from 2011 and 2013 she worked at the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence as a research and evaluation specialist. Her work at NCCADV involved providing evaluation and research support for NC Delta Project and the NCCADV Child Advocacy and Services Enhancement Project. Kris's publications span both academic and public venues, and her work has been recently featured in Slate Magazine, in Feminist Current, and on PBS To the Contrary. And she has over 10 years of undergraduate teaching experience and currently is teaching at Meredith College, a private women's college in Raleigh, North Carolina. And you can learn more about Kris at www.krismacomber.com and find her on Twitter at KrisMacomberSoc. Okay. Kris?
Yay, Kris.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Kris, we hear you fine, and it's Ben. Do you mind if before you start your presentation, Casey runs us through the intros of the participants, because we kind of didn't do that.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thanks. Casey?
Sure.
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, we just wanted to take a moment to find out about who's participating today. So you should see our first polling question, which is how would you describe your role? And the choices you have there to select from are administration, community education, community organizing, direct service, prevention, or is there something else that we missed in our list? And if so, please share those in the text chat. Okay. So yes, if you would, see that people are chiming in with their answers, and I'm going to go ahead and share the results. So you can see that most people identify as prevention as their primary role, but there is a spread across these different roles. So we're seeing community education, and we're seeing direct service work. So there's a fairly nice spread in terms of who's participating today. Thank you so much for responding to that question. We're going to ask our second polling question of the audience. And again, this really is helpful to our presenters so that we know exactly who we're talking to and what your experience is. And this question is, have you participated before in a training about engaging men? So your choices are you kidding? I facilitate these types of trainings. Or yes, many times, yes, once before, no, this is my first, or it's complicated, I'm not sure. So please go ahead and chat your answers. And while you do that, I'm seeing other kinds of roles coming into the text chat. Student, victim specialist, nurse director, college health, TA provider on the national level, researcher, fund development, state coalition staff. It's great to see all of you on today's call. I'm going to go ahead and share the results from this poll. We're seeing that, it's actually fairly even, but what we're seeing, most people either have once before participated in a training like this, or it's their very first time. So this is very much an introduction for a lot of the participants here. And then we have the 4% that say, are you kidding? This is my work. This is what I do. And also a number of you who have done this many times before. So it really runs the gamut, and we really appreciate you taking the time to answer those polling questions. I'm going to go ahead and close those, and I will pull up Kris's slides. All right, Kris, take it away.
Thank you, Casey. I want to just also say how happy I am to be here today on this webinar. I love webinars. I'm a big fan of this format, and it's been a delight to work with Trace and Ben, and for those who have had the pleasure of working with Casey Keene, you know how awesome she is, so this whole experience has been fantastic. So I want to go over some of our webinar goals, which will help sort of inform our conversations today. We want to highlight the many benefits that are accompanying men's growing involvement in anti-violence work, because there are many. We also want to highlight the challenges and some of the strains and tensions that are also coming with men's growing involvement in leadership. Thirdly, we want to examine some of the obstacles in creating effective accountability practices. And then I will also help identify some practical action steps for implementing accountability at the group and organizational level. We also have some corollary goals. We want to draw on your experiences and insights to help shape the conversation. So we had this vision that today's webinar would feel as much like a real in-person workshop as possible. We wanted it to be interactive. We want to draw on the wealth of expertise on this call today. And going along with that goal, we also are trying to build and contribute to the network and community of those of us who are interested in this topic, and to kind of create an ongoing conversation about engaging men. So we hope that we can add to that momentum today. To give you a brief background about my approach as a researcher, I identify as an activist scholar, which for me means that my research, the goals of my research is to inform social justice and social change. And I like to do work that contributes to the research practice gap. And my research mainly focuses on issues related to social inequality, gender-based violence, intersectionality, male allies, and social change. So I wanted to begin with thinking about, I'm going to go back one slide, sorry. I wanted to sort of think about men's anti-violence activism and their involvement as one of the many historical shifts and trends that anti-violence work has seen. So if we go back to the 1970s, right, we can think about how effective and powerful grassroots organizing was. And then in the 1980s, we had a shift where violence against women was defined as a public health problem, and this wasn't a private issue, but a social problem. And then in the 90s, we had the passing of VAWA. And then in the early 2000s, we had this focus on primary prevention. So these are just naming some of the key major turning points in this movement. And I think right now, we're on the brink of another major turning point and another huge shift in this work, and that is the increasing emphasis on mobilizing and engaging men, not only in gender-based violence activism in work, but also in this broader movement of gender justice activism. So I think while we're talking about this as a major shift for this movement, I think it's important that we identify some of the benefits of this shift, because it certainly has been, I think, a necessary and strategic turning point for this work. So some of the benefits that I've identified in my work is that anti-violence messaging is now reaching wider audiences. Redefining violence against women as a men's issue and focusing on masculinity and focusing on men invites men to be agents of change in ways that we haven't seen historically. And thirdly, as dominating group members, men often have access to institutional and ideological power, so they therefore can influence social change. I think this is a good point to sort of pause, though, and acknowledge that when we talk about male privilege and male power, it's important that we note how not all male-identified persons benefit the same from male privilege. Certainly in our social hierarchy, depending on race, social class, and gender identity and sexuality, religious status, and ethnicity, we certainly want to make sure that when we talk about male privilege that we are aware of other forms of inequality. So we want to turn to you now, now that I've identified some of the benefits that we see in terms of men's involvement. What are some of your successes and triumphs, and what are your success stories with your efforts to engage men? So feel free to take a moment and text chat that in, and then we will have some time to hear and learn from you all.
So Kris, I'm seeing social media, I'm seeing bystander. I think that's fraternities doing awareness events, improving.
Okay, I'm starting to see them come up now. Yep. Okay, male volunteers, organizing focus groups, leadership involvement, focus on male leadership, sports teams partnering with us, helping with primary prevention. Yep. Some ways. Men on the board of directors, so men serving in leadership, administrative roles, fraternity partnerships, campus work, which is an important part of the engaging men work for sure. Great number of men who want to help. These are coming in really quickly, so I'm going to try to go back and read through some of these. My son's all-male school to start a domestic and sexual violence awareness program from Wendy on a personal level. Thank you for that. Greek life, again, fraternity partnerships, student-led groups on campus focusing on men's engagement. A call to men to college campuses to be a part of our orientation. So bringing in some of these men's national organizations. That sounds great, Sherry. I'd like to hear how that goes. Youth leadership program has had some success. Discussion groups focusing on graphic novels, resource development. Men's only event to raise. So it looks like there's a lot of different levels of engagement, both in terms of activist group level on college campuses to connecting what's going on college campuses and activist groups to men's national anti-violence organizations, as well as doing work with fraternities and outreach in the community to raise awareness. So it looks like there's a wide range of ways that you all have had some positive experiences and some successes and triumphs around your efforts to engage men. We want to turn to now, the focus of my research question was, how are the increasing efforts to mobilize men impacting this historically women-led movement? Because even though those of us tuned into this work see this groundswell of men involved, this movement is historically women-led and still is, in a lot of ways, a women's movement. So how is this increasing enthusiasm and the funding that is spent on men's programming, how are these efforts impacting this movement at large? And what do we already know about this? There's a growing body of research on men's involvement, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do have a slide here that sort of highlights the different topics that folks have looked at, how men come to be involved in anti-violence activism, barriers that shape bystander behavior, effectiveness of different anti-violence programs that engage men, and then the reproduction of male privilege and gender inequality, which is where most of my work has sort of fallen into that category, and which is what our conversation today is going to spend more time focusing on that. This is also an opportunity I wanted to plug, if you haven't heard hot off the press, the book Some Men by Feminist Allies. When we wrote this slide here, the book hadn't yet come out. So that just got published 2 months ago, actually, and I would have added that to our slide if we were going to do this right now. So moving right along, I want to discuss a little bit about my research methodology. I conducted 31 interviews with activists and advocates. I was with 18 women and 13 men, ranging from folks who work on college campuses to executive directors of rape crisis centers, people working at the state coalition level, national speakers, authors, and educators. I've also did close to 100 informal interviews over the course of my research. I also did 2 years of participant observations of anti-violence work. A large portion of that was on engaging men work, so going to men's anti-violence workshops, trainings, and conferences. And I also collected an abundance of archival data collection, which was everything in terms of books that have been written, essays that folks have written, to conference flyers to posters, campaign pins and buttons, and anything related to the material culture of anti-violence activism. And some of the main processes that I've looked at, I looked at three main processes throughout my research. One is, how are men recruited and mobilized into engaging men work? What strategies are used and what are those impacts? Secondly, how is the movement confronting inequality and privilege internally, and what does that look like? And third, ally identity construction. So the second process, confronting privilege internally, is what I'm going to be focusing more on today. So confronting inequality and male privilege, some of you may have heard the term. It's kind of gaining some traction within anti-violence activism, that men ride a glass escalator. And what that refers to is the phenomenon of the experience of men in female-dominated workplaces. In 1992, a sociologist by the name of Christine Williams conducted research on the experience of men in female-dominated work, like social workers, librarians, nurses, and elementary school teachers. And she found that when men enter these female-dominated professions, they tend to get promoted relatively quickly to the leadership roles. Now, this term runs counter to the experience of women who, when they work in male-dominated workplaces, they hit a glass ceiling and are often don't make it to the top leadership roles, and when they do, it's often after a lot of struggle. So the experience of men is quite different in female-dominated workplaces. So I use that concept to explain the experience of men in anti-violence activism. Men are sometimes occupying visible leadership roles, maybe too early when they're not quite ready for it. They don't have the experience and expertise, but the excitement to get men involved, I think, ends up putting them in those situations, and some of it is that they put themselves in those situations as well. And men's voices in this work are afforded a legitimacy and a credibility and an authority that women have to work really hard to assert. And oftentimes men's contributions are seen as exceptional, and women's are just seen as ordinary and expected or minimized. And men's status in this work can be elevated, often referred to as the pedestal experience of men being put on a pedestal, often for sometimes doing things that don't require much effort. Not to say that there aren't men who are doing a lot of fantastic work, but sometimes men's contributions can be overstated. So in addition to this male privilege, I also found throughout my research that it's what I refer to as the interactional violations that happen when gender inequality at large, existing outside of the movement, and sexism and systems of inequality get brought into the movement. So what that can look like is men dominating work meetings, taking over a work meeting, what activists often refer to as taking up too much space. I've done interviews with advocates who talked about men who were kind of new to the scene and very eager, ended up sort of taking over and co-opting the conversation and did much more talking than listening. So those sort of interactional transgressions are also something that is important to be mindful of. This can also look like using troubling and sexist language. So I think it's important to take note that these sort of violations can range from microaggressions and seemingly small, subtle things to much larger patterns of sexist behavior. Throughout my research, I was made aware of one instance when men who were at an anti-violence conference were later seen going to a strip club. There was that incident that happened. Another incident involved a man selling T-shirts at a national anti-sexual violence conference who had skipped his restraining order hearing to attend that conference. So again, these violations can be, seemingly minor transgressions to some very large patterns of sexist and troubling behaviors. So I want to bring in some of my data. Sorry, the slides got turned around a little bit. Sheila is somebody who has been working in the anti-violence, the anti-rape movement specifically for over 30 years. And her account here that I'm going to read really quickly is, I think, really gets at the heart of the tensions. She says, you know, when it's women involved in anti-violence against women work, it's like, please, I'm falling asleep. This is so boring. Men involved in anti-violence against women work, oh my God, awards, recognition, media attention, money. It's the perfect example of how sexism works in our society. Pardon the curse word here, but I will read it as she said it. She says, the men get all of this attention for facing something they've been, quote, fucking up since humanity started. So I think it's important to, you know, take note of the frustration in Sheila's account. It's something that I saw throughout my research with women advocates, is suddenly men show up and anti-violence activism is something worth listening to and something worth paying attention to, and that tension is reminiscent of gender inequality and sexism more broadly, and that's a problem. So certainly concerns about men's involvement are not new. They date back to the 1970s when very few men were involved. But I argue in my work that with this recent push to involve all men, get as many men involved, and that means that we're recruiting coaches and soldiers and fraternity brothers and athletes and all, you know, this strategy is to get as many men involved as possible. I argue that with that strategy, with that approach, the focus on the nature of men's involvement is even more critical today than in the past. So to sort of get at that concern, Elsa, who works for a domestic violence organization, said, in the movement, people have been like, we need to get men in. They're very excited about getting men, all men. We need all men, definitely. But there's risk in doing that because along with their integration, men are replicating sexism. Men's involvement is positive, but with it comes challenges we need to address. It's a really, really hard line to walk. So Elsa's account, I think, also reflects this tension between, on the one hand, men's involvement is critical and necessary and we need them, but on the other hand, we've got to be careful about how men are being integrated into these spaces. So what have been your challenges? We kind of want to move more now towards hearing from you again and learning from you. What have been your concerns or challenges? And so if you can spend a few minutes text chatting that in, we would love to hear about your experiences. Okay. A lot of these issues, everyone is excited that they're there. Yes, it's not just men replicating sexism, it's women too, absolutely, in terms of how we all need to be held accountable for replicating sexist language and sexist patterns of behavior. I get frustrated when men seem to frame this as rescuing, right? So the knight in shining armor effect. Thanks, Yvonne, for that. People still thinking it's just a women's issue. People in it for the wrong reasons, right, that men are going to come and save the day. There's been a lot of reference to men as coming in and saving things and being the superheroes. A lot of people will choose a man for an engaging man position, even if a woman has more experience, right? That's something that we've talked about as well as the presenters, is engaging men work sometimes makes people think that that a woman would not be qualified to work with other men, when in fact women have been doing work with men in this movement for a very long time, and men being afraid of being stereotyped if they get involved, right? So men being resistant to it. Although what we find more often that happens is that men end up getting accolades and sort of identity rewards for doing it. Social and cultural messages that we have to struggle against, from Rita. I'd like to hear more specifically about what you mean by that. Extreme fear around upsetting or offending men by talking about sexism. Yeah, so the idea of like we might scare men away if we go to the heart of the matter and we start talking about patriarchy. It's one thing to talk about masculinity and to talk about men, but then that's a different conversation sometimes than talking about misogyny and patriarchy male privilege. How do we get more men involved and how to keep them engaged for the long term? Yes, one of my interviewees said, we have no problem getting men to show up. But what we have a harder problem with is keeping them at the table, keeping them there for the long-term involvement. Okay. The challenge is often politics. I wonder what you mean by that, DeMarcus, by politics. Okay. These are such fantastic contributions, and we're definitely going to spend some time after the webinar looking through these. So for the sake of time here today, I want to just move along a little bit. So where does that leave us in terms of how do we deal with this? The other question I was really interested in with my research was, okay, so we have this issue of, power and privilege, and men's involvement isn't, if anything, more men are going to get involved, and men's involvement is here to stay. So how are advocates and activists responding to these tensions? And what I have found is that along with men's expanding involvement has come the increasing emphasis on men's accountability. And you'd be hard-pressed today to go anywhere without hearing about men's accountability. It's sort of like this buzzword that we hear about a lot. And there's this assumption in the work that holding men responsible for their behaviors can, as my co-presenter Ben has written about, to use his term, minimize the damage. That holding men accountable can help mitigate some of the unintended consequences, i.e. the sexism and male privilege. So what I found in my research is that the discourse, the talk around accountability and around men's accountability is widespread and has been successfully integrated into the culture of the movement. That is something that if you're in this work and you're in this movement, you are familiar with the idea that men's accountability is important. However, what I found in my research is that there's, some significant obstacles and barriers for effective accountability, which I sort of identified a gap between discourse and practice, that there's this discourse that's widespread and well integrated, but that there's a gap between accountability, discourse, and practice. And there's three major obstacles that I see. One is definitional inconsistency, and basically that's just a fancy way of saying accountability means different things to different people, and there is no sort of unified, consistent definition of accountability. Secondly, despite the widespread emphasis on men holding each other accountable, women overwhelmingly are still the ones carrying the burden of drawing attention to issues of male power and privilege. And third, accountability is often practiced on a case-by-case basis, sort of like in the moment, ad hoc, something happens, what do we do to respond, which is one strategy, but what's lacking is seeing accountability built into institutional culture. So it has not, it's struggling to be institutionalized within organizational culture. Some of the recommendations that I make based off my research is to require and or encourage newcomers to receive training and education work before stepping into visible leadership roles. And I think the same goes for women who are in this work, like women advocates. It's really important that they have a mentor and that they receive the right training and education. Secondly, men's organizations and groups should or could connect to women's organizations and groups. When men work in isolation, they're detached from women's leadership and survivors' voices, and that can be very harmful. If men are only attending engaging men events and listening to other male leader voices, then they are detached from the broader movement, which is still predominantly women-led. And what I found throughout my research was that when engaging men was in the title of the conference or event, men were widely represented. But very few men tend to attend events that do not make men central to the event. So some other recommendations that I offer is for organizations to implement and institutionalize a process to address issues of privilege internally. So similar to how there may be women of color caucuses and the LGBTQI caucuses, that there be a caucus to to address and to hold and create space to discuss male privilege and how to hold conversations within our own workplaces, and not something that has to be done on a stage at a conference only, but within our own workspaces. And lastly, I suggest a sort of like a facelift for the term accountability. I don't think we should abandon the term altogether. I think it still has utility, but to reconceptualize accountability so that it includes an explicit emphasis on building gender equity within the movement. If we think about the term accountability, it's a little bit abstract of a word. A more active and precise language would be build gender equity and model gender equity. So for the goal of integrating men into the work is not just to hold them accountable, but integrate men in ways where we're building gender equity inside of the movement. So I think focusing more explicitly on what we can be doing inside of the movement, which is building gender equity, might offer some more concrete action steps other than holding someone accountable or being accountable. So some take-home points I just want to leave you with is, as men's involvement in anti-violence work continues to grow and as more men are emerging as leaders, we want to celebrate this, but I also think that the issue of male power and privilege becomes even more salient. And in turn, a focus on how to implement effective accountability practices is even more critical. So some questions that I want to explore and that I even have about my own research. Oftentimes, I have more questions than answers. And one of them that I have is, as men's involvement in anti-violence work grows and is, I'm sorry, that's the wrong slide. One of the questions that I have is, how can we be critical of male privilege and inequality without reinforcing the gender binary? I struggle with this in my own writing about men, and I'm writing about men all the time, and how do I use different language, like language that is not reinforcing the gender binary and that is not privileging the gender binary and those who identify as men. Secondly, are there different nuances occurring in prevention versus direct services work? That question was sent in to us from Steve MacArthur in Vermont, who said, you know, as a man working in direct services, how might my experiences be different than men working in prevention? So those are some questions that I think we can explore in the future. And we look forward to hearing your questions as well. And thank you. Thank you for your time today.
Kris, this is Trace. We had a really interesting question pop up about your research. Could we ask that really fast before we hand it over to Ben?
Sure.
Okay. The question was, Kris's research touches on intersectional, does any of Kris's research touch on intersectional male engagement issues? And that was, I want to make sure I'm giving it the right name to that. Let's add for that question because it was really good.
Yeah, let me look back. So you mean it in terms of male, like involving men and not just looking at men as one homogeneous group as men, but looking at the different nuances within that, right? Is that what you mean?
I believe so. It's Ashley Mills' question, so maybe she can elaborate a little bit more in the public chat.
And I think she was wondering, sorry, this is Casey Keene chiming in. I think that Ashley
Sure.
was wondering specifically about international.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my research focuses on the U.S. Mainly. That's the focus of my research. I'm thinking of, if I can think of other people who are doing similar work about international specifically, Men Engage, they've got a fantastic resource about men's accountability, and they do global scale work. So my work does focus specifically on the U.S., but I would definitely refer them to Men Engage, and they have some resources and toolkits that are looking at more of a international focus on how to engage men.
Okay, great.
Was there any other questions? Yeah. Anybody else have anything I can address about my research specifically, or maybe we should probably hold off on that until the end so we can get to Ben?
Yeah, let's maybe hold off just for a sec, and then we'll move forward when we
Great.
have our question and answer time too.
Great.
So,
Okay.
and if anyone's interested and they can still go ahead, there's plenty of time to go ahead and get your questions into the chat box. We'd absolutely love to hear what your thoughts are. Now, if it's all right, I'll go ahead and I will introduce Ben. So thank you, Kris, for everything. I was just writing that I just get completely caught up in your research. It's just so exciting for me. Well, Ben is a friend of mine, and I appreciate him so much. And Ben has done trainings and performances to stop sexism and gender-based violence for almost 30 years. He's spoken in 45 United States, Canada, China, the Czech Republic, England, Turkey, India, South Africa, and Nepal. And Ben identifies as a recovering sexist and believes that every man must challenge gender-based violence in the world and themselves. He fell in love with his incredible wife, Lucinda, 15 years ago, and while they were doing improvisational comedy together in Maine, and they live together in Maynard, Mass, and have no children except for themselves, which is fun. And for more information about Ben's one-man play, Voices of Men, be sure to check out his website. It's www.voicesofmen.org. Ben?
Thank you, Trace. I feel the same way about you, and this is so much fun for me. I hope the participants are having as much fun as I am. I'm honored to follow you, Kris, and we have fewer participants this time. It looks like we're up to 158 than we did last time, but I'm really loving the discussion in the text chat. So I'll get through my piece as quickly as I can so we can get to some more questions. Some of what I say will be familiar to many of you, it sounds like, from your level of expertise, and just because I know some of you, so I definitely don't want to be a mansplainer on this issue of violence against women. And I'm trying to, there we go, now I can advance, especially on this issue of engaging men or on issues of gender-based violence in general. But I do think it's important too, as we have done, be clear on our definitions of gender-based violence, as Trace stated them at the beginning, as I will elaborate on a little bit. And fortunately, because of the format of this webinar, the text chat offers us the opportunity to co-teach, and I would love it if you would continue to co-teach, those of you who have already been adding to this, our learning via the text chat. The text chat is available to everyone afterwards, as are these slides and our handouts. I want to begin by asking a participant a yes or no question, which kind of has multiple choice options, and it's already been answered near the beginning. Kaylee Shockley said that, yeah, men's engagement has reinforced male privilege. So I want to ask you, has your work or your agency's work to engage men, has that gone well, or has that gone not so well? So Casey, if you don't mind bringing up that multiple choice question, if your answer is no, it's gone fine, then fantastic. And let us know what you've done, and so that we can learn from you if your answer is number 4. But if your answer is, yeah, it's been a little problematic, as some of you seem to have answered already, I've found that those problems tend to clump themselves into 3 different categories. We don't have enough staff time. We've tried it. Very few men show up, or, yeah, men show up, but they do some of these problematic behaviors, benefit from the glass ceiling, from being on a pedestal, the pedestal effect, and if you would also, yep, Clark is already chiming in on the text chat, and I would really appreciate that as well. So we have most folks, most respondents, big problem is, yeah, nobody doesn't come. Only 2% of you have no difficulties at all, and that's sad, but unfortunately not surprising. And 10% of you talk about the topic that we're really focusing on in this webinar, which is men presenting themselves as allies, but then disappointing us later. All right, is there a way to say how many people have answered? Should we cut the question out now? Casey?
Yes, I'll go ahead and close this question.
All right, sounds good.
Go for responding.
Now, in January, I took a little more time to introduce myself. We called that the engaging Ben part than I will today. But suffice to say that I was engaged by women. I was engaged by women like many of the women I see on this webinar. And some of the men in this webinar, Patrick Lemon, my friend from so many years, they have also inspired me, but it turns out a lot of what they learned was from women. So I'm showing you a picture of Detective Sergeant Ann Odell, one of my best friends and role models in doing this work. My adult life was spent mostly working in rape crisis centers and domestic violence programs, and some of you are working at those places now. When I started attending national conferences, I saw that women like Ann and the late, great Ellen Pence were not only fantastic presenters, but were using humor to talk about these difficult topics of domestic violence, sexual violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. And so, inspired as I was by their example, I wrote this play that Trace mentioned, Voices of Men, and I performed that play in all those places that she said. The play uses humor, and you already know what it does because she said so. The other thing I learned from women like Ann and Ellen and Trace and Casey and Kris is the fact that gender-based violence does not exist in a vacuum. So one man abusing one woman or raping one woman can't really exist without a culture that favors my gender, that favors my race, that favors heterosexuals over GLBTQ folks. And so as this wonderful pyramid from Haven in Michigan shows, if we work for a culture, conversely, that pays women equally, that respects women and girls and values women's leadership, etc., this pyramid will crumble. And I want to at this point highlight, as I did before in the text chat, that this is not only April Sexual Assault Awareness Month, this is also Meet Us on the Street, International Anti-Street Harassment Week. Certainly opportunities for male allies to get involved. And furthermore, another thing I learned from women is that most men don't commit overt acts of violence. So if this is a bell curve of what men do, this left side, there's not so many men who kill women, who rape women, but there are many men who do what was the bottom of that pyramid, who tell sexist jokes, who laugh at sexist jokes. And the vast majority of men remain silent when it comes to challenging gender-based violence and listening to women, being allies to women. So there's a tendency within our movement to say, okay, the male allies, this part of the bell curve, are the good men. But the reality is that all of us as men, even the allies, are at some point part of the problem, and all of us benefit from male privilege. Make sense? So those of us who are trying to do this work as your aspiring ally, make mistakes, do it wrong, and it seems what I've noticed, and that Kris and others have noticed, is we do it wrong in very specific ways. So in listening to women's experience of myself and other male allies and the mistakes that we made, the things we did that were not so helpful, I listened and I wrote them down and put them into various categories, and then I called the folks at the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project to see if I could make versions of their amazing power and control and equality wheels. And then we had several helpful discussions, and they said I could, provided I use these new wheels only when accompanied by the original ones. So I want to put that on to you. Feel free to use these wheels as long as you use them onside the original wheels. This power and control wheel for men working to end gender-based violence is, as all things I'm doing, a work in progress. So some of the slices might be able to be combined, and maybe I'm missing some things. Please let me know. All the examples on the wheel came from stories that women had told me, or things that I've observed, sometimes observed in myself. So I would love to. Hopefully you've had a chance to read these pie slices. By the way, when I could, I tried to mirror the original power and control wheel. So in the original wheel, we have using economic abuse. So I have a slice on of the new wheel that says competing for funding, but most of them didn't quite do that mirror. Casey, if you don't mind, we have another question that takes each of these pie slices and puts it into an option that you can answer. So those of us, I guess the 10% of you that answered that men have been engaged but do so in a problematic way, what have we done? Try to pick the best answer as far as which parts of the pie slices did we do. Did we demand to be included? Did we compete for funding? Are we taking credit for women's work? Or is it something else? And then please elaborate in the text chat. Clark's talking to himself. How hard is it to invite my male acquaintances to wear a ribbon? We can do more than wear a ribbon. Thank you, Clark, and I agree. We can do more. I'm going to get to that when we talk about the 5 steps to engage men to try to ameliorate this concept of unhelpful male be ally. Yeah, Patrick. I showed up, didn't I? Come on, I'm good. All right. Wow, big votes for refusing to look inward. Thank you. And sad, putting up the tent but not helping with food. Exactly. Thank you. All right, so interesting that we had 0% saying other. So the pie slices are, I guess, pretty accurate. Those of you who know the original power and control wheel, which I hope is most of you, know that there's an equality wheel. And so just as there's an equality wheel, I created a male accountability wheel to indicate traits of a male aspiring ally who does walk the talk. So for this one, instead of competing for funding, we have the slice that says financially supportive. We as men make more than women. We should be tithing, right? We should be making donations to women's anti-violence groups, not demanding to be paid more, which is in some cases what happens. So if you would please text chat your examples of accountable male allies, men who are getting it right, and as specific as possible what we are doing that fulfills Kris's stated definition of accountability that includes building gender equity and building gender equity specifically in this movement. Casey, if you would put these pie slices up as options that folks can vote on. Just for myself, I think there are days when I am pretty good at embodying the male accountability wheel and days when I don't, and when I do one and sometimes more than one slices on the male power and control wheel. Expressing emotions other than anger from Elliot. Willing to do the in the trenches work from Tara George, which echoes what was been mentioned before. And pretty soon we should get the votes in on these on this polling question. Okay, open to learning is the biggest thing we do right, and working collaboratively. The other things, hardly any of us welcome suspicion, are financially supportive, or do the equal division of labor that's been mentioned for a couple times by a couple of women. Fantastic. All right, so if this is the problem, how do we engage men in a way that doesn't do this? Well, there's no magic way to do it, obviously. Sorry if you were trying to take this webinar knowing how not to do it, how to engage men and have every men be building gender equity as a way of accountability. But one way that I've found to ameliorate it is to make us work from day one, not to say, okay, will you be an ally, but to say, will you do this specific task, and to engage us gradually. So rather than having us, and as Kris said, some men do this on our own. We will say, I want to be the leader, or we'll just do this visible leadership thing. And some communities understandably get excited when a man attends an event and says something that sounds reasonably feminist. And we advocates who are desperate for male allies, the biggest response at the beginning was not enough men show up. So when men do show up and say something reasonable, we get excited. We invite him to be on our board. We invited him to be on our coordinated community response team. So that's understandable, but maybe wait. Maybe educate us first, step one, ask us to do something small, step two, and then have us sign up for the volunteer training, step three. All right? To get a little more specific, the raising our consciousness and educating us, that's something that most of the agencies and NGOs that we work for are doing anyway. We're giving workshops, we're having ads in the paper, we're having ads on TV that dispel the myths about gender-based violence and raise awareness. As we're planning on doing these educational events, and you know, my play Voices of Men was designed to be something like this, and I designed it in mind to get folks not just educated about the issues, but also get them excited to do something. And I asked people at the end of the play, will you do this one specific thing? And I work out with my host what that specific thing is going to be. And one of the things is to wear a white ribbon. But that's not enough. We have to, wearing white ribbon, they can go off and do that on their own. We want men, or I want men to be doing something in collaboration with the women that have been doing all this work. So when we think of these small tasks, and they can be almost anything, a lot of local programs have engaged men in the activities listed here, so please take a moment and text chat examples of how your community has engaged men in these fairly simple tasks, like wearing a white ribbon, attending the vagina monologues, marching in Take Back the Night marches. I have a little, by the way, these little Excel spreadsheets that you're seeing, I just did them. I'm not an Excel spreadsheet person, so they're not very elaborate. They hopefully will be a good place for you to start from, and they are available in the handouts sections. So we're seeing some answers. Participating in Walk a Mile in Her Shoes by Gretchen and by Tara George. We didn't put that in our list of specific step two examples. Oh, Denim Day, thank you, by Peace Over Violence, Damie Meyer. We didn't, asking for help with the setup, thank you, Ava Marie. We didn't put up Walk a Mile in Her Shoes only because we had some discussion about it as co-presenters and had read some things that were, how do I say this, where Walk a Mile was not done well in some communities, where the opportunity for men to walk in dresses and high-heel shoes was not done with respect to the trans community, the cross-dressing community, but I have, just for myself, I've seen it done very well, or that has been done with such collaboration, and I've actually been involved in places where it's been done well and done not so well. Another way I think that's done not so well is if you just have men walk, and the pedestal effect that Aubrey Hall mentioned and then Kris mentioned happens where men get a lot of credit for walking a mile wearing a dress and wearing high-heel shoes, and all the media coverage is about that. I think that happens more often when the men are just allowed to walk without doing some work beforehand, work in the form of listening to a survivor speaker or listening to someone give the basics about sexual violence. And some are agreeing with me. You may notice that as men get involved in the Start By Believing campaign or in any of the other things that folks are mentioning, that some of them will be eager to do more. And for these men, I think we should be ready to sign them up for our volunteer training. At the educational events, we should have a sign up for the volunteer training, and if it's a big educational event, we should make sure there's a volunteer training happening right after the big educational event, or right after the big step two event, the Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, the Take Back the Night March, etc. A lot of our volunteer trainings are long. They're 40 hours, they're 60 hours. It's a long time to get to know our men and our people that are getting involved, and we'll start to be able to set up mentoring relationships with those people and with those men. At this point, the Excel spreadsheet kind of ends up looking more like patient notes. You really are forming this mentoring relationship with this man, inviting him to conferences, meeting leaders, have them meet other advocates, be part of this amazing community. It will be, at this point, it'll be hard the way it's hard for us as advocates, and so for these men, they have to learn to do self-care, and I want to take a minute to plug the Self-Care for Advocates group on Facebook that was started by Trace Fleming, who spoke near the beginning, and you'll get the opportunity to join that group later. Now, going back to the taking a class for a second, I think, in my opinion, our volunteer training should be covering gender socialization, should be covering intersectionality, and if you're part of a college campus, see that if you can partner with your local domestic violence or sexual violence program. Speaking from that former perspective, we love that when you partner with us. If they don't have such a training, maybe a women's studies class on campus, or you could create a class on violence against women. You don't have to reinvent that wheel. It's already being done. And during the class, notice which men are eager to learn, which ones get defensive. If you have a majority of men in your community who are of a certain makeup, who are white, maybe try to target some leadership of men of color, who are cisgender men, meaning men who are born men, then try to encourage the leadership and mentor some trans men, some gay and bisexual men, and also try to target men who are leaders in their community. And these might be the same men. I'm not saying it's mutually exclusive. You know, your athletes, your fraternity men, etc. Make sense? So then step 5 is leadership. Again, we might want to jump into leadership right away. Make us wait. And some folks mentioned that there are sometimes openings for staff, including staff for engaging men. I don't think I agree with what the participant said and what Kris said. Kris and I actually wrote a paper on this. I don't agree that the engaging men staff person has to be a man. I think that women, frankly, as a gender, you are more experienced in engaging men than we are. It just wasn't always called engaging men. It was called volunteer recruitment or working. I don't know. And we as men are latecomers to this issue of gender-based violence in general and engaging men in particular. So we shouldn't be seen as just as the only experts on the thing. But in terms of hiring staff, if you are hiring someone, no matter what gender, my friend and mentor Lorianne Castell is on this webinar, and I think she would want me to say that if you procure specific funding, that rare specific funding for engaging men, don't depend on that. She would want me to say, try to diversify your funding sources so the program will be long-term and it won't go away when that particular grant goes away. Now, the men who are taking the leadership at this point ideally will do the work that you did originally for the step 1, for the educational events. The reality is that these men, can take the leadership, but that they'll make mistakes and that you will have to mentor them to get it right. And this will take up some of your precious staff time that you have to do other things like run support groups, answer the hotline, supervise other staff. And that this should be thought about when you as an agency are having that conversation of, do we have the capacity to do this engaging men work, and what kind of resources is it going to require of our staff, and what will we have to do less of? And so when these men make mistakes, when we make mistakes, how do we respond when you confront us? I think that's almost the final exam for these engaged men, as for male allies, is if you say, here's something you did that's wrong, do we respond with defensiveness, or do we say, oh, okay, tell me more? Or do we do what I've often done, which is get defensive and then come back and say, okay, sorry, I was defensive. What were you trying to say? Frankly, I think that men who are unwilling to be accountable in this way of accepting feedback from women, specifically when it comes to sexism and male privilege in our own behavior, I don't want those men in positions of leadership in this movement. We'd certainly use any men to do many of the other things in steps 2 and so forth, but the men who either are asked to take leadership or present ourselves as leaders, that's kind of on the job description, that's not one of those optional things. That's one of those things that you really need to have. So that's about all I have. I'm just thrilled again to be here, and want to thank, in addition to Kris, Trace, and Tracy, I want to thank Patty Bronco and Michelle Shuey from the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence who are tuning in as well. And from here, I think we go to questions.
We do. Thank you so much, Ben, and thanks everyone. I'm just in awe of how much conversation is going on, and how we've got some really good questions. So please feel free, if you are interested in asking any more specific questions that Ben or Kris might be able to answer. So please give us a chance to answer those by putting those in the Q&A. Kris, are you with us still too?
Yes, I am here. Of course.
I just wanted to double check. I'm going to pose this question for you guys first, because I've been collecting our questions throughout this. And one of the first questions actually comes from Ashley Cornelius Hester, who's a friend of mine, and she is lovely. And she was wondering if you could speak on how do we work on accountability within our own agencies, and are there any formal policies and procedures that they can implement?
Yes. Well, I talked about some of the recommendations in the presentation, but what I didn't mention was some of the concrete ways that folks can work on building gender equity in the movement when working with men. And so one example is to sort of combat the perceived pay discrepancies that men in this work get paid more for doing a national talk or for doing a presentation. There's a lot around that men come in, and some people will say, well, there's just fewer men, so they're in more demand. But when women enter male-dominated workplaces, we don't see that same effect happening. So this isn't like a supply-demand effect. It's a gender inequality effect. So one thing you can do is have a policy, a very simple policy that you write in your workplace that says, no man will be paid more money than any woman who is coming to speak for our conference or for our biannual conference, period. Like, we will not pay a male speaker more than we pay a female speaker. That's one way to sort of institutionalize pay inequity. Another way that you can address it, I think, via policies is what I've heard a lot about, and what I also have observed working within the movement, is when women's organizations partner with men's organizations for an event, to like co-host an event or co-sponsor an event. It sounds at the onset like a fair, equitable division of labor, but then when things get going, the women's organization ends up doing a lot of the logistical work, setting up the tables, bringing the food, doing that sort of traditional gendered work. Well, one way to sort of combat that is to develop a plan of what do you want your working relationship with men's organizations to look like. And you can actually say that, like, to us, an equitable partnership looks like the following: A, B, C, D, and E. That we will share the division of labor, we will arrive at the site on time, at the same time, and really have those sort of things that come up preempted, have them written out. Like, what do you want a partnership with a men's organization to look like before you enter into it? Because I think what happens is organizations deal with it, and then it's like, oh gosh, next time we hope that it doesn't go like that. We hope that, or we won't work with them again, because that just taxed our staff way too many hours. Like, we put in about 20 hours onto that event, and they put in about 12 hours, and that's not fair. So coming up with a vision of what an equitable alliance would look like, I think, is another example. So those are two, I think, examples that can help institutionalize accountability within workplace culture.
Yeah, thanks, Kris. I answered this in the text chat, so I won't take up more time, but it's a great question. I see a lot of other great questions, and rather than answer the ones that I happen to see, I think a better process, Trace, is you have been culling them, so I'll wait.
Okay. Well, here's the next question, friends, and this is, I'm going to laugh a little bit because there's a pun. Can you comment on male athletes and gender violence, and how do we tackle, sorry, pardon the pun, this issue more aggressively with, in terms of gender violence education?
Well, I mean, I think there are fantastic women's groups and men's groups doing this. The Mentors in Violence Prevention project at Northeastern University Center for the Study of Sport and Society, say that 10 times fast, here in Massachusetts, my home state, has been doing some groundbreaking work. Many of our friends, Jackson Katz is one of the co-founders of that. But I think, so there's two parts to that. I think the male athletes, both professionally and in college, are sometimes the perpetrators of that violence, and then other times targeted as community leaders to speak out and be engaged in prevention efforts. And I think we have to, frankly, do both at the same time. But I'm curious what Casey, Trace, and Kris have to say.
Kris?
Well, I think with the athletes, I think like Ben had said, MVP is doing fantastic work. And some of these issues seem like new issues, like, oh, like the role of athletes is so important now. It has been important for a really long time. And yeah, like Jackson Katz helped found that, Ben, what was it, back in the late 80s, early 90s maybe? It's been a while that organization has been doing that work. And then there's Coaching Boys into Men, and I know Futures Without Violence do a lot of work with fathers. Men Stopping Violence does a fatherhood initiative. So there's, I think, a lot of resources out there for how to work with athletes. And I think Ben spoke to a lot of it, so I don't know if I can add that much more to that, Ben.
Yeah, and I would add, please, participants, it just got quiet in the text chat, so I would love it if you all would consider each of these questions aimed at you as well. So I would love to know your thoughts on working with athletes and your thoughts on organizational procedures to institutionalize accountability.
Great, great. And actually, almost speaking out on that, we had a question from Melissa Johnson about, can you briefly speak to the tension between men not pulling their weight and men's voices drowning out women's voices? And Melissa's question is also, my male IDing friends have told me that it's tough for them to determine which they're doing at times. That's a really interesting thought there.
Yeah, it's tough for me to realize it too. And thank you for the question. I was involved when I was working in Maine at the Abused Women's Advocacy Project in a vigil. We would have a vigil. We started me and a man named Jeb Enoch started a group called Mainly Men Against Violence and Sexism. Get it? Mainly Men, and we were in Maine. So we collaborated, I think, with other men's groups and some women's groups to host this vigil anytime there was a domestic murder anywhere in the state of Maine. And in Maine, that was about 10, 15 times a year. And then what happened is what happens with a lot of these male-focused or male-led initiatives. The women did most of the work. The women who were staff at the domestic violence program, specifically the domestic violence program in Portland, where we mostly had the vigil, did most of the work, and we men would show up and give interviews. And pretty quickly we realized how problematic that was. And no, actually, it was quite slow that we figured out how problematic that was. And I think it was only when women confronted us on it that we realized that we were not pulling our weight, and just had to, as DeMarcus I think has said early on, we had to make this a constant reminder to ourselves as men to not let this and other injustices happen, and not just wait for something to go wrong, like being told we're not doing it, pulling our weight.
Oh my gosh! And I'm sorry. I was just thinking about this, Tracy, and I was just thinking about how much it takes to be able to kind of have that self-reflection. So that was an important move, and also speaking about the bravery of the women, it must have taken also to speak up too when they were uncomfortable.
Yep.
There was a question from Paul Bancroft next, and he was talking about, have there ever been any efforts to organize the men who work in this field, which I'm assuming is the anti-gender violence movement field.
I'm sorry, the question is, have there been what? Have there been efforts to what?
There any efforts to organize the men who work in this field?
So I guess I'll start answering that too, Kris, if you don't mind. We've mentioned Men Engage, and I had the great fortune to attend the Men Engage, the last international conference in New Delhi, India, where we had over 1,000 women and men focused on this topic. So that was an effort to engage the men doing this kind of work, both academic and non. So yes to that. The one before that, 5 years ago in Brazil, where we have at least one participant on the webinar from Brazil, I unfortunately could not go to that one, but some of my colleagues did. I don't know, Patrick, if you went, Patrick Lemon, who's on the webinar today. And I anticipate that Men Engage and other groups that we mentioned, like Promundo and the White Ribbon Campaign, will be continuing to do that. I also I would like to see more men attend conferences like the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence Conference, NCADV conferences. And we've had at NCADV conferences and other movement conferences, we've had men's caucuses where we meet as male-identified folks and allies to try to do that kind of work. And I think the Men Against Violence Yahoo group maybe started out of one of those meetings.
Kris, do you have any thoughts about that too?
Yeah, well, if they're interested in organizations, I think the last slide with the resources could give them organizations that if they were interested in linking up with. Yeah, I guess it depends on what level of involvement they mean by organizing, like professional organizations or more grassroots activists. If they had a specific question about how they wanted to get involved in it, then maybe we could speak to that more. But I think maybe the resource slide might be helpful for them to look at different organizations who are engaging men.
And absolutely, we're going to talk a little bit about the resource list in just a bit, but please feel free also, while we're still talking for the next couple minutes, this is not an exhaustive list of the resources that we pulled together, but please feel free, if you have any additional ones that you think need to be up there, please let us know. It's such a great opportunity for us to share together.
There was a question, Trace, about male survivors, and even though this webinar really did not focus on that, I wanted to make sure this page was up to answer that, malesurvivor.org and oneinsix.org.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I was just seeing that too, and those are some really great resources. I work with male survivors and have used those resources, and the One Blue String is pretty neat. So they're doing some cool stuff. So we have a little bit of time for a couple more questions. One of those questions has popped up, and it is if you could speak a little bit more about mentorship, about how do you find a mentor in this work?
From a man's perspective, or?
I believe for an advocate just starting out in male or any gender.
Well, it happened quite naturally for me. I had the stereotype of feminist activism, and I was nervous to go to my first few feminist conferences. I guess it's almost 30 years ago now, anticipating that, like the stereotype, feminists would all be angry man-haters, and I found that was not the case, that I was warmly welcomed and even befriended by women like Ellen Pence and Ann Odell that I've pictured before, women like Suzanne Farr, whose work I had read, Homophobia, A Weapon of Sexism, were willing to have lunch with me. We're willing to hang out with me. And once Facebook came along, we're willing to be my Facebook friend. And the thing that they weren't tolerant of was my sexism. So what feels to many men like you're not very welcoming of me is actually not being welcome of the sexism. What feels like being anti-male is actually anti-male sexism, and I think it's important for me to realize that. So it happened pretty organically, and I've had the privilege of, like I said, having jobs in the movement, usually as a community educator or volunteer coordinator or a combination of both. And then my supervisors have all been feminist women, many of whom are survivors themselves, and they've taught me everything I know. They're fantastic mentors, and that's how I get them.
That was great, Ben. I'm just like sort of sitting with that was great. I think people who I've had I have had the pleasure of having such generous people with their time, generous, and the way that I think seek out mentors is by asking questions and showing interest in listening and learning. I think a commitment to keep learning. There's always going to be someone eager to pass on information if you're willing to learn. And some of the mishaps that I have seen with somebody actually just texted in about men's anti-rape groups on college campuses tend to think that they're the first group ever to have done that on campus. And they reinvent the wheel, and then what happens is because of the nature of college, they come in a few years, and then that wave leaves, and then another group comes in and they go, hey, we're men against rape, and and then they start from scratch. And I think part of what they do wrong is they don't link up with the women's groups on campuses. They want to do their own thing, and they're disconnected from mentors on campus, faculty, people who work on campus at the Women's Center who are doing IPV work, and that I think the lack of mentoring can help explain why men's anti-rape groups on campus tend to have this chronic pattern of like starting from scratch every couple of years.
Friends,
Sorry if I real quick answer Patrick's question.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to mention really fast, though, that we have about 5 minutes left, so we might just be only able to take one or two more questions.
Okay.
All right. Well, Patrick's question, how do we address male leaders or national organizations that consistently fail to live up to these standards but continue to hold themselves out as leaders, I think is an excellent one. I think he's not the only one that's thinking of this, and I think that part of that's on those groups and on those leaders. So let's say me, as somebody who has taken some visible leadership, I want to say, and I've seen other leaders say this, please let me know if I'm messing up. Please let me know how, and it's not on others to point out errors. It's on me, but I think these organizations and these leaders should be visibly open, and for example, a call to men ends each of their events by having feedback from women of color in the audience. And if the last word is, yeah, this was messed up because of this, this, and this, then that's the last word, and they say, okay, thanks. I don't know what you think, Kris.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think part of what Patrick is speaking to and asking about is the sort of gap that I've identified as well, which is like there's all this great rhetoric and there's these visible male leaders talking about accountability, and it's so important that men are accountable, but then accountability is really about power. Like someone who has power to do something to hold someone accountable. So who's to say that a men's national organization, who can hold them accountable if they do something? Like that's why I think this focus on accountability only distracts from what we're actually trying to do, which is like modeling gender equality. If we get so tangled up into accountability, what does it look like? How do we implement it? It's sort of an abstract passive term. And what would it look like to hold an organization accountable? who has the power to actually restrict them from doing something, from taking something away from them? I mean, how do you hold someone accountable in a way that they then change because of it?
Yeah.
I don't know how people can do that to an organization other than not working with them. I think holding them accountable or holding somebody accountable would be like, we refuse to partner with you again. We were not going to donate to your agency. We will, something like that, I think, is one way that leaders can be held accountable if they're affiliated with an organization. I'm not sure if that's a helpful response. I'm kind of thinking on the spot here about that. I'd like to talk more about that, though, because I think it's a really important issue, and accountability needs to be more than just a rhetoric. Because part of how men show that they're good allies, right, quote, good allies, is that they talk about accountability.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to be more than just talk. It has to be something that informs how they do the work.
Yeah,
Kris,
like
thank you so much
saying that
for
we're
that
feminists and sorry, Trace.
No, and I agree. I hate we are almost out of time.
Yeah.
I'd love us to continue to talk about this some more. And actually, what we can do is maybe continue this on a little bit in our Q&A document that goes out to everybody. Any of those questions that were not answered, we will absolutely have those in a document that can go out later on, which please, if you have any other additional questions, please add them, or if you'd like to communicate with us later, our Twitter handles are out there, and please feel free to contact us that way. We want to thank absolutely everyone for participating. Kris, Ben, thank you so much. And I'm so grateful to Casey and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and to WISE and to Second Chance. It's just been a remarkable day. So thank you all so much for participating with us, and we really all look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you.